A prison bully picked on the new inmate who, born with superhuman strength, annihilated 500 men. Welcome, my beautiful family! Get ready for a story that will tug at your heartstrings and remind us all of the enduring power of connection, even from the most unexpected places. As we delve into this tale, I want you to think, when faced with overwhelming power or immense injustice, how do we find our humanity, and what does it truly mean to connect with another soul? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The clank of the cell door echoed a lifetime of isolation, but it was the whisper of a name he never wanted to hear again, that truly heralded the end, and an annihilation no one could have foreseen. The air in Blackgate Penitentiary was a suffocating blend of stale sweat, disinfectant, and a pervasive metallic tang that KL had come to recognize as fear. He sat on the edge of his cot, ramrod straight, his hands resting on his knees, palms up, as if offering himself to an unseen force. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, scanned the scarred concrete walls, not searching for an escape, but for reassurance. Reassurance that the carefully constructed emotional cage he lived in remained intact. Every muscle in his broad frame was coiled, not with tension, but with meticulous internal control, a life's work dedicated to containing the raw, impossible power that thrummed beneath his skin. He'd been here for 3 weeks, and already the whispers had begun. The new fish, they'd called him. Quiet one. Too quiet. KL knew what they were really saying. Weak. He welcomed the misjudgment. Weakness in this place was a shield. His true nature, his born gift, or curse, was something far more terrifying than any inmate could comprehend. He'd learned through painful, accidental lessons that a gentle touch from him could shatter bone. A moment of anger could bring down walls. His childhood was a patchwork of hushed apologies, broken objects, and the crushing weight of isolation. His parents, loving but terrified, had taught him to suppress, to fear, to hide, to be invisible. And KL had become a master of it, crafting a life devoid of touch, of emotion, of anything that might cause a ripple in the calm surface he presented to the world. He remembered the last time he lost control, years ago. A sudden, unexpected collision, a desperate grab to prevent a fall, and a young girl's arm had snapped like a twig. The horror in her eyes had seared itself into his soul, a constant reminder of the monster lurking within. Since then, he'd lived in a self-imposed prison of silence, his expressions carefully neutral, his voice a low rumble when he spoke at all. He ate alone, walked alone, existed alone. It was safer that way, for everyone. He'd accepted that his life would be one of perpetual solitude, a monk in a monastery of his own making, dedicated to the worship of control. The only emotion he allowed himself to feel was a dull ache of longing for a touch, a laugh, a shared moment that would never be. Across the sprawling complex, in a sterile observation room overlooking the main yard, Elara Fenatz watched the same restless sea of inmates through reinforced glass. Her uniform, crisp and dark, offered no comfort against the chill that seemed to permeate Blackgate's very foundations. Her face was etched with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. It was the fatigue of a soul that had seen too much. Years in this concrete mausoleum had hardened her, sanding down the edges of her youthful idealism until only a tough, pragmatic core remained. She saw the new inmate, the one they called KL, sitting alone. He was different. Most new arrivals either strutted with false bravado or cowered. KL just was. A still point in a tempest. Ilara had started as a correctional officer with a naive belief in rehabilitation, a flicker of hope that the system could mend broken lives. That hope had been systematically crushed, replaced by a grim acceptance of the inevitable. She'd seen good men turn bad and bad men turn worse. She'd seen the casual cruelty, the rampant corruption, the soul-crushing despair. Her own personal tragedy, the senseless death of her younger brother years ago, a victim of street violence that had gone unpunished, had cemented her cynicism. Justice, she'd learned, was a luxury rarely afforded and often bought. Now she simply did her job, kept her head down, and counted the days until retirement, her heart a guarded fortress. She had no room for hope, no space for vulnerability. Not anymore. She watched Kyle, her gaze sharper than most. There was something in his stillness, a coiled energy that belied his apparent calm. She'd seen men like him before, men who held secrets, men on the brink. But Kyle's aura was different, less a threat, more a deep, resonant hum beneath the surface. He wasn't aggressive, not even defiant. He just to contain, to be utterly, fundamentally alone. It resonated with a part of her own soul she kept locked away. Below, in the yard, a heavy-set inmate with a sneer carved into his face and the word Thorn tattooed crudely across his neck sauntered past Kyle's cell block. Thorn, the self-proclaimed king of this particular concrete jungle, had a predatory gleam in his eyes. He paused, his gaze fixing on Kyle's quiet form, a smirk spreading across his lips. The new fish was ripe for the breaking. The glint of challenge was unmistakable. Kyle felt the shift in the air, a familiar tightening in his gut. The silence he had cultivated, the invisibility he had mastered, was about to be violently interrupted. The day the central event happened was just like any other, or so it began. The monotonous clang of meal trays, the shuffling feet of inmates, the low murmur of conversation that rarely rose above a grumble, all familiar, all part of the suffocating rhythm of Blackgate. Kyle sat at his usual solitary table in the mess hall, his eyes fixed on the tasteless slop on his plate, his mind an empty canvas, deliberately devoid of thought. He ate slowly, each movement precise, controlled. It was a ritual, a form of meditation against the chaos that constantly threatened to break free from within him. He felt the familiar pull of eyes on him, the silent assessment, the weighing of his perceived weakness. He ignored it, as he always did. Thorn, however, was not to be ignored. He moved like a predator, slow and deliberate, his hulking frame casting a shadow over Kyle's small table. His two main enforcers, hulking men with vacant eyes, flanked him like grotesque bodyguards. The mess hall, usually a cacophony of low-level noise, seemed to hold its breath. Inmates paused mid-chew, forks frozen, eyes darting between the immovable new fish and the approaching storm. Thorn reached Kyle's table, his shadow engulfing him. Kyle kept his gaze on his plate, a silent refusal to engage. "Well, well, well," Thorn's voice rumbled, thick with menace, "if it ain't the Invisible Man. What's the matter, fish? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to look your betters in the eye?" He kicked Kyle's chair with a heavy boot, just hard enough to make it scrape across the concrete floor. The sudden, jarring movement sent a tremor through Kyle, a tiny, almost imperceptible surge of the dormant energy within him. He fought it down, focusing on the rough texture of the table, the metallic taste of his food. "I heard you're a quiet one," Thorn continued, leaning in, his breath hot and stale against Kyle's ear. "I don't like quiet ones. They usually got something to hide. And around here, secrets get you broken." He snatched a piece of Kyle's bread, tearing into it with a sneer. You got a name, Invisible Man, or are you just a ghost? Kyle remained silent, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes of every man in the mess hall on him, a silent chorus of anticipation. They expected him to cower, to break, to prove their assumptions of his weakness. And every fiber of his being screamed to comply, to maintain the facade, to keep his secret buried. But Thorn wasn't done. He reached out, a meaty hand grabbing the front of Kyle's cheap, ill-fitting prison shirt, yanking him forward until their faces were inches apart. The smell of stale cigarettes and aggression filled Kyle's nostrils. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, punk!" Thorn roared, his spit flecking Kyle's face. Something inside Kyle snapped. Not with anger, but with a primal, desperate need to defend the last shred of his carefully constructed anonymity. To him, Thorn wasn't just a bully, he was an excavator, digging at the very foundation of his control. The sudden violent invasion of his personal space, the sheer insolence of the touch, was a violation. In that split second, instinct overrode decades of meticulous self-suppression. He didn't think, he didn't plan, he simply reacted. His hand, which had been resting open on his knee, closed into a fist. Not a punch, not a strike, but a simple, desperate clench. And as his fingers tightened, the power, a seismic force contained for so long, erupted. It wasn't an explosion of light or sound, but a silent, terrifying manifestation. The air around Thorn shimmered, almost imperceptibly. Thorn, who was still holding Cale's shirt, suddenly went rigid. His eyes widened, not with pain, but with utter, incomprehensible shock. A low, guttural gasp escaped his lips. Then, with a sound like ancient timber groaning under immense pressure, Thorn's body began to compress. It started subtly, a slight sinking, a reduction in his imposing bulk. But then it accelerated. His limbs drew inward, his chest caved, his head seemed to shrink into his shoulders. The bone-deep groan of his body was sickeningly audible in the now silent mess hall. It wasn't violent or bloody, but profoundly disturbing, an unnatural implosion. His eyes, fixed on Cale's, held a terror beyond anything Cale had ever witnessed. In less than 3 seconds, where Thorn had stood, there was now a compressed, crumpled mass of flesh and bone, barely recognizable as a human being. A grotesque, impossible sculpture of what once was. The mess hall erupted. A collective gasp, then a horrifying silence, followed by a torrent of panicked shouts and overturned tables. Cale stood there, his hand still faintly clenched, his storm cloud eyes wide with a terror far greater than any Thorn could have inspired. He had done it again. He had lost control. And the magnitude of this loss, the sheer impossible scale of the destruction, was a cold, hard knot in his gut. His gaze swept over the petrified faces, the men scrambling away from him as if he were a contagion. He saw not fear, but a deeper, more primal horror. Up in the observation room, Ilara had been watching the confrontation unfold with a detached weariness. Another bully, another victim, the usual script. But then Thorn had grabbed Cale, and something had shifted. She saw Cale's brief, desperate clench of the hand, and then she saw Thorn disappear. Not literally vanish, but collapse in on himself, a sickening, impossible act of physical erasure. The sound that emanated from the mess hall wasn't a riot, it was sheer, animalistic terror. Her years of cynical detachment shattered in an instant. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her mind, trained to analyze, to rationalize, found no framework for what she had just witnessed. It defied every law of physics, every understanding of human capability.
Her hands flew to the intercom, but her voice failed her. What would she even say? A man just compress another man? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and adrenaline. She stared at Cale, who stood amidst the chaos he had wrought, looking more terrified than anyone. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the impossible remains of Thorn. This wasn't anger, this wasn't malice. This was the horror of a man who had unleashed a force he couldn't contain, a force that had just, in an instant, annihilated another human being with a gesture. The guards rushed in, batons drawn, sirens wailing. But the inmates weren't fighting, they were scattering, screaming, pointing at Cale as if he were the devil himself. Ilara watched as Cale was wrestled to the ground, his resistance surprisingly weak, his eyes still fixed on the crumpled mass. A chill, unlike any she had ever known, settled deep in her bones. This wasn't just a new inmate. This was something else entirely, something beyond her comprehension. And in that moment, her world, her carefully constructed understanding of reality within these walls, had irrevocably shattered. A new kind of fear, colder and more profound, had just taken root. What do you think of this shocking turn of events, my friends? Has Cale truly lost control, or is there more to his power than meets the eye? And what will this mean for Ilara? Let me know your theories in the comments below. The aftermath of Thorn's impossible demise was a maelstrom of controlled chaos within Blackgate. Cale was immediately isolated, thrown into a high-security solitary cell, a sterile, padded box designed to contain, not understand. He sat on the floor, back pressed against the cold, unyielding wall, his knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them in a desperate attempt to hold himself together. His mind replayed the scene, an endless, horrifying loop. Thorn's sneer, the primal surge, the sickening compression. He didn't scream, didn't rage. There was only a profound, suffocating emptiness, punctuated by the sharp, stabbing pain of guilt. He had promised himself, swore to himself, that he would never lose control again, not after the girl, not after the quiet, terrified life he had built around himself, a life designed to protect others from the monstrous anomaly he was. And yet, here it was, worse than before, far worse.
A single gesture and a man was gone, reduced to an unidentifiable mass. The guards, the interrogations, the frantic medical teams trying to make sense of the incomprehensible, it all faded into a distant hum. All that mattered was the truth. He was a danger, a weapon, a force of nature unleashed, and he had no right to exist among others. His initial reaction wasn't fear of punishment, but a deep, crushing self-loathing. He deserved to be locked away, not just in this prison, but forever from all humanity. He deserved the isolation. It was his penance. He resisted every attempt at questioning, offering only silence, his eyes vacant. He refused food, water, sleep. He retreated further into himself, building an even thicker wall around his emotions, hoping to bury the monster so deep it could never resurface. This resistance wasn't defiance, it was an act of profound self-punishment, a desperate plea to disappear entirely. He clung to the cold logic that if he ceased to exist, he could hurt no one else. Upstairs, Ilara Vance was a whirlwind of activity, her usual stoicism replaced by a frantic energy she hadn't felt since her brother's death. The initial shock had given way to a burning need for answers, for logic, for anything that could explain what she had seen. The official reports were vague, contradictory. Cardiac arrest, one suggested, despite the physical evidence. Panic-induced trauma, another, even more absurd. No one dared to write down the truth, the impossible truth of what Thorne's body had become. The other guards, the ones who had witnessed it, were shaken, pale, speaking in hushed tones about the devil's work or some kind of hallucination. They wanted to forget it, to explain it away. But Ilara couldn't. Her mind, usually so pragmatic, was fixated on Cale's face in that moment of impact. It wasn't the face of a killer, not in the way she understood it. It was the face of profound shock, of utter horror. He was as much a victim of his own power as Thorne had been. She remembered the stillness about him, the deep well of contained energy. It wasn't aggression she'd sensed, but something else, a powerful, almost desperate control. She also remembered the impossible look in Thorne's eyes, not of pain, but of pure existential bewilderment. She resisted the easy explanations, the convenient narratives. Her colleagues dismissed Cale as a monster, a freak of nature, or simply a lucky shot with an unknown weapon. The warden, a man more concerned with reputation than truth, wanted to sweep it under the rug, classify it as a bizarre, unexplainable incident, and move Cale to an even more isolated facility. "Vance, you saw nothing," the warden had stated, his voice low and firm. "You observed a disturbance, and an inmate suffered an unfortunate, albeit inexplicable, medical event. You will write that report, and you will move on." But Ilara couldn't move on. The image of Thorne's impossible end, Cale's horrified eyes, the way the mess hall had become utterly silent before erupting in panic, it was seared into her memory. It challenged everything she thought she knew about the world, about justice, about humanity. She felt a strange pull, a reluctant curiosity that warred with her ingrained cynicism. Her scientific mind, buried beneath years of bureaucratic indifference, resurfaced, demanding answers. She started digging, sifting through Cale's sparse file. No prior convictions, no history of violence, a quiet life, an isolated one. An orphan, raised in a series of foster homes, each report mentioning his unusual quietness, his avoidance of physical contact. A boy who seemed to actively try to disappear. The harder she looked, the less sense it made. He wasn't a criminal in the conventional sense. There was no motive, no history of aggression to explain such an act. And the nature of the act itself, it was a gaping hole in her understanding. The official explanation was a lie, a cover-up. And something inside Ilara, a spark of the idealism she thought long dead, flared to life. She felt an urgent, almost irrational need to understand Cale, not just as a prisoner, but as a phenomenon. She couldn't let them just bury him in a deeper hole without understanding what he was or why this had happened. This resistance to the convenient narrative, this burning need for truth, was a dangerous path for a Blackgate guard. It was the first time in years she had actively gone against the system, a system she had learned to passively accept. And it terrified her, yet compelled her forward. The days that followed Thorne's incident bled into a monotonous, suffocating routine for Kyle in the solitary confinement unit. The walls were gray, the light dim, and the silence was so absolute it screamed. He was a ghost in his own life, a prisoner within a prison. His food trays were delivered through a slot, his sparse interactions limited to the metallic clang of the door and the shadow of a guard's boot. He didn't speak, he didn't protest. He simply existed, retreating further into the bleak landscape of his own mind, convinced this was his deserved fate. The crushing weight of what he had done, the sheer impossibility of it, had cemented his belief that he was a danger to all life, and isolation was the only answer. But outside his padded cell, the gears of the system, however reluctantly, were turning. The official story of cardiac arrest was flimsy, and the higher-ups knew it. The whispers among the inmates were becoming too loud, too unsettling. The incident had rattled the very foundations of Blackgate's fragile order.
There was a growing consensus that Kyle couldn't just vanish. His presence, even in solitary, was a constant, unsettling reminder of the unknown. An outside investigative committee, wary of a PR nightmare, decided that Kyle needed a full psychological and physiological evaluation. Not within Blackgate, but at a secure, undisclosed facility several hours away, one designed for inmates deemed special cases. It was a logistical nightmare, and Alara found herself unexpectedly at the heart of it. Due to her initial observation report and her tenacious, if unwelcome, questioning of the official narrative, she was assigned to the transport detail. The warden, hoping to get her off his back and perhaps even punish her for her insubordination, had placed her in charge. It was a fool's errand, he thought, a waste of resources, but it would get Kyle out of his prison and Alara out of his hair. The transport vehicle was a heavily armored windowless van, the kind usually reserved for high-value targets. Kyle was brought out, shackled at the wrists and ankles, his head bowed, his body language one of utter surrender. Alara watched him from the back of the van, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. He looked smaller, almost fragile, in the dim light of the internal compartment. Her hardened exterior warred with a flicker of something akin to pity. This wasn't the monster the other guards whispered about. This was a man utterly broken by something he couldn't control. The journey was long, punctuated only by the rumbling of the engine and the occasional sharp turn. Kyle sat across from Alara, separated by a mesh partition and the two other guards. He never looked up, never met her gaze. He was a statue of despair. Alara found herself studying him, searching for clues, for understanding. His face, though gaunt, held a strange purity, a lack of malice that confounded her. Then, about halfway through the journey, the van hit something. Not a minor bump, but a bone-jarring impact that sent them lurching violently. Tires screeched, metal groaned, and the world outside became a cacophony of twisted steel and muffled screams. The van swerved wildly, careening off the road with terrifying speed. Alara was thrown against the internal wall, her head striking the reinforced panel with brutal force. Stars exploded behind her eyes. One of the guards cried out in pain, the other was knocked unconscious. When the ringing in her ears subsided, Alara found herself slumped against the seat, her head throbbing, a metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Smoke was seeping in from the front of the van, and she could hear the groans of the other guards. The vehicle was on its side, tilted at a precarious angle. Her vision was blurry, but she could see the crumpled remains of the driver's compartment, the front of the van utterly destroyed. She pushed herself up, wincing, her hand instinctively reaching for her sidearm. The other guards were incapacitated. She was alone, with Kyle in the mangled remnants of the van. The mesh partition had been twisted and torn by the impact, creating a gaping hole. Kyle, miraculously, seemed unharmed, though he too had been thrown. He was looking around, his eyes wide, a flicker of something she couldn't identify in their depths. "Are you all right?" Alara croaked, her voice raw. Kyle didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the wreckage, on the smoke, on the distant sirens that were just beginning to wail. His shackles, though still intact, were digging into his skin, an ironic reminder of his confinement even in this moment of unexpected freedom.
Outside, the world was a mess. They had collided with a semi-truck, which lay overturned, its cargo spilled across the highway. There were cries for help from the truck driver, and the sickening smell of leaking fuel filled the air. More sirens were approaching, but they were still minutes away. A flickering spark ignited near the fuel spill. "We have to get out of here," Alara said, trying to pull herself to her feet. The urgency in her voice cut through Kyle's haze. He looked at the mangled door, then at the spark, which was growing into a small flame. The van was trapped, and the fuel spill was rapidly becoming a fire. "The door's jammed," she grunted, pushing against it with all her might. It wouldn't budge. The other guards were still out cold. She looked at Kyle, then at the gaping hole in the partition. He was free, in a sense, from his immediate restraints within the vehicle. He could escape.
He had the opportunity. But then the small flame licked higher, closer to the van. The heat was becoming palpable. Ilara struggled again, grunting in pain. Kael watched her, a strange battle playing out in his eyes. Escape or help? His entire life had been avoiding contact, about not hurting. But now she was in danger. His danger. And for the first time in a very long time, the desire to protect, to do something, warred with the deeply ingrained terror of his own capabilities. A small tremor ran through the van as the flame grew larger. The choice was clear. They were bound together, not by shackles, but by the immediate, life-threatening crisis. They were forced into proximity, the usual distance between guard and inmate obliterated by the impending inferno. And in that terrifying moment, an unexpected connection began to forge, born of desperation and the primal urge to survive. My online family, the unexpected has struck. Kael and Ilara are now trapped, facing a deadly choice. What will Kael do? Will his instinct to protect override his fear of his own power? And how will this shared trauma change their dynamic? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The growing heat from the spreading fuel fire pressed in on them, a suffocating blanket that amplified the frantic rhythm of Ilara's heart. The smoke, thin at first, was now thickening, stinging her eyes and catching in her throat. She coughed, a harsh, painful sound, and pulled at the jammed door again, despair blooming in her chest. It was useless. Trapped. Kael watched her, his storm cloud eyes flickering between the struggling Ilara and the encroaching flames. The terror of his own power warred with a primal instinct to protect, to simply do something. His hands, still shackled, clenched involuntarily. He could feel the familiar thrum beneath his skin, the latent energy coiled and waiting. His entire life had been a desperate attempt to contain it, to be still, to be invisible. But here, stillness meant death. Invisibility meant failure. We have to try the back, Ilara gasped, her voice hoarse, pointing weakly towards the rear of the vehicle, which was more intact but still sealed. I can't move that. It's too heavy. Kael looked at the heavy steel door, then back at her. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes held a fierce, unyielding determination. She wasn't giving up. And in that moment, something shifted within him. It wasn't about him anymore, not entirely. It was about her. A strange foreign feeling, this protective surge, but undeniably potent. He moved, surprising Ilara with his sudden, decisive action. He knelt beside the back door, assessing the twisted metal, the strained hinges. The other two guards were still unconscious, slumped against the side of the van. He took a deep breath, the scent of burning fuel filling his lungs, and placed his shackled hands on the door. He didn't focus on destroying it, but on moving it, on carefully, precisely applying just enough force. It was a terrifying gamble. Too much, and he could rip the van apart, potentially igniting the fuel. Too little, and they would burn. He pushed. There was a groan of stressed metal, a high-pitched shriek of tortured steel, and then, with an impossible effort that seemed to defy the very laws of physics, the heavy back door of the armored van bent inward, then ripped away from its hinges with a sickening tear. It wasn't a violent explosion, but a controlled, almost surgical detachment. A gaping hole now stood where the door had been, revealing the smoky, fiery inferno just meters away. Ilara stared, her jaw dropping. The sheer, impossible strength. It was real. Everything she had witnessed in the mess hall, everything she had struggled to rationalize, was undeniably, terrifyingly real. And yet, Kael hadn't annihilated the door. He had opened it, with a precision that chilled her to the bone. "Go!"
Cale urged, his voice a low, rumbling command, his eyes scanning the immediate danger. Now! Ilara scrambled through the opening, coughing, her legs shaky. She turned, expecting Cale to follow, to escape the inferno. But he was pulling at the unconscious guards, trying to drag them towards the exit. "Cale, no! Leave them! We have to go!" she cried, the heat searing her skin. He ignored her, grunting with effort, trying to free one of the heavy men. The flames were closer now, licking at the edges of the van. A small explosion erupted from the overturned truck, sending a shower of sparks over them. "They'll burn," Cale finally said, his voice raw with a pain that resonated deep within Ilara. It wasn't just about the men, it was about the desperate, centuries-old human need to save, to protect, even at the cost of one's own life. "You can't save everyone," Ilara yelled, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him. Her fingers brushed his bare skin through the torn sleeve of his prison uniform. And in that brief touch, something happened. Not physical, but emotional. A flash. Ilara saw a boy, no older than 10, his eyes wide with fear, staring at a shattered vase, his hands trembling. She heard a woman's hushed, terrified voice. "Cale, what did you do? How could you break it like that? You have to be more careful. You can't keep doing this." The boy's face crumpled, tears welling in his eyes, not of defiance, but of profound, self-blaming sorrow. Another scene. A teenager, alone on a playground, watching other kids play, longing to join, but keeping his distance, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. A whispered thought, "I can't touch them. I can't hurt them." The fleeting vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Ilara disoriented, a cold dread settling over her. A memory? A projection? What was that? She shook her head, trying to clear it. Cale was still struggling with the guard, the heat intensifying. "I won't leave them," Cale said, his voice flat, resolute. He looked at her, and this time their gazes locked. Not again. His words, simple yet profound, coupled with the strange, invasive flashes of memory, painted a picture of a man haunted not by malice, but by an uncontrollable power that had led to a lifetime of accidental destruction and enforced isolation. He wasn't choosing to be a hero. He was choosing not to repeat a past failure, not to abandon those in need. He was choosing redemption in the face of annihilation. "Fine," Ilara yelled, the inferno's roar now deafening. "But you need to be careful. Just get them out." Together, amidst the swirling smoke and searing heat, they managed to drag the two unconscious guards out of the burning van, just as the fuel tank ruptured with a massive explosion, engulfing the vehicle in a fireball. They stumbled away from the inferno, coughing, gasping for breath, the heat still radiating against their backs. The sirens were closer now, a cacophony of emergency vehicles. They collapsed on the side of the road, miraculously clear of the wreckage, the two unconscious guards sprawled nearby. Cale, still shackled, lay panting, his face streaked with soot, his body trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the terrifying exertion of containing and unleashing his power, even in a controlled manner. Ilara, nursing her throbbing head, looked at him with a mixture of terror and a new, bewildering understanding. He hadn't just saved them, he had revealed a deeper, more painful truth about himself. The monster she had been told he was, the freak they wanted to bury, was in fact a deeply traumatized individual, burdened by an impossible gift, fighting against his own nature to do good. And for the first time in years, Ilara felt a tremor of something she hadn't anticipated: empathy. The arrival of emergency services was a blur of flashing lights, frantic voices, and urgent assessment.
Ilara, despite her own injuries, immediately took charge, directing paramedics to the unconscious guards and giving a terse, carefully edited account of the accident, omitting any mention of Cale's impossible strength. She knew, instinctively, that the truth would only complicate matters further, potentially endangering Cale in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She watched as Cale, still shackled, was quickly surrounded, his face a mask of weary resignation as he was checked over by medics. He offered no resistance, no explanation, simply allowed himself to be moved and prodded, a silent figure in the eye of the storm. Later, after a chaotic trip to a local hospital for evaluation, Cale found himself in a temporary holding cell within a secure wing, awaiting transfer back to Blackgate. The room was small, sterile, and cold.
He sat on a narrow bed, his gaze fixed on the single barred window, watching the last sliver of twilight bleed from the sky. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emotional exhaustion. He had used his power, deliberately, knowingly, to save lives. And while the act itself felt right, the terrifying memory of Thorne's fate still clung to him like a shroud. He was a paradox, a force of destruction compelled by an urge to protect. The sound of the door sliding open broke his reverie. Ilara stood there, her uniform singed and smudged, a bandage wrapped around her head, a faint bruise blooming on her temple. She carried a tray of lukewarm food and a bottle of water. The guard outside the door gave her a hesitant look, but Ilara's gaze was firm. "I'm assessing the prisoner's psychological state post-trauma," she stated, her voice authoritative. The guard nodded, closing the door. Ilara placed the tray on the small table. Cale didn't look at her, his gaze still fixed on the window. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and shared trauma. "You saved us," Ilara finally said, her voice soft, devoid of her usual official tone. "You saved those men, and you saved me." Cale flinched, a subtle tightening of his jaw. "I shouldn't have been there," he mumbled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, the first words she'd heard him speak since Thorne's incident. "No one should be around me." Ilara sat on the edge of the opposite bed, carefully studying him. "Why do you say that, Cale?" He finally turned, his storm cloud eyes meeting hers. They were filled with an ancient, profound sadness. Because I hurt people. It's what I do. I can't control it, not always. And when I don't—" He trailed off, the image of Thorne's compressed form hanging heavy in the air between them. "What happened with Thorne wasn't an act of malice," Ilara countered, her voice gentle but firm. "I saw your face. You were terrified. You lost control. And just now, you used that same power to save us, to break us free. You chose to help." Cale shook his head, a gesture of desperate denial. "It doesn't matter. The outcome is the same. People get hurt. I tried to be careful. I tried to disappear. My whole life has been about not touching, not feeling, not being too much, because every time I am, someone breaks." He recounted, haltingly at first, then with a growing, painful honesty, the fragmented memories Ilara had glimpsed, the accidental breaking of toys as a toddler, the shattering of precious heirlooms, the terrified whispers of foster parents, the incident with the young girl's arm, an innocent brush that had led to a fractured limb and a lifetime of self-imposed isolation. He spoke of the crushing weight of constantly containing an unstoppable force, of the loneliness that came from fearing every touch, every spontaneous emotion. His voice was devoid of self-pity, simply stating the stark, brutal facts of his existence. He was a man made of glass, living in a world of fragile china. Ilara listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. Her initial fear of his power began to recede, replaced by a deep well of empathy. She saw the boy who had longed for connection but knew he could never have it. She saw the man who bore the crushing burden of a dangerous gift, not with resentment, but with a profound, self-sacrificing acceptance of his solitary fate.
"It sounds incredibly lonely," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Cale looked at her again, and in his eyes, Ilara saw a flicker of surprise, a hint of something fragile and hopeful. "It is," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Always. I've never really known touch that wasn't followed by fear or brokenness." Ilara, on an impulse she couldn't explain, extended her hand, palm up, towards him. Not to touch, but to offer. "Not all touch brings fear, Cale," she said, her voice steady. "Not all power is for destruction. Sometimes it's just looking for a way to be understood." Cale stared at her hand, a profound tremor running through his body. The gesture, so simple, so human, was a stark contrast to the life he had known. It was an invitation, not to unleash, but to connect. He didn't reach for her, couldn't dare to. But the offering itself was a moment of peace, a fragile, unspoken understanding that transcended the bars and the uniform. For the first time in his life, Cale felt truly seen, not as a monster or a threat, but as a man burdened by an impossible existence. And for Ilara, in listening to his story, the hardened cynicism that had been her armor for so long began to crack.
She saw a reflection of her own profound loneliness, her own burden of grief in his eyes. In this sterile room, amidst the lingering scent of smoke and the echoes of near death, a fragile, unexpected bond, born of shared vulnerability and a nascent understanding, began to take root. It felt like healing was possible, even in this broken place. "My online family, this is a beautiful moment of connection. Cale has finally opened up, and Ilara has shown him profound empathy. What do you think this newfound understanding will mean for both of them and for the path ahead? Share your hopes and fears for our protagonists in the comments below." The fragile peace cultivated in the sterile hospital room was a fleeting luxury. As soon as Cale was deemed medically stable, the system reasserted its cold, unyielding grip. He was transferred not back to Blackgate, but to a highly classified, deep underground facility operated by a shadowy government agency. It was a place designed for anomalies, for things that defied explanation. Ilara, despite her protests, was barred from accompanying him, deemed too emotionally invested by her superiors. The parting was abrupt, a brief, guarded exchange of glances across a sterile corridor, before Cale was led away, his face once again a mask of quiet resignation. Ilara felt a pang in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her brother's funeral: helplessness. Back at Blackgate, Ilara found herself in an impossible position. Her official report about the transport accident, carefully sanitized to exclude Cale's powers, was accepted. But her persistent, quiet inquiries about Cale's new location were met with stone walls and veiled threats. She knew he was being studied, dissected, likely experimented on. The thought gnawed at her, fueling a growing sense of outrage. The empathy she had felt for him, the understanding forged in the fire, had transformed into a burning need for justice, for protection. She began to operate in the shadows, using her access as a correctional officer to dig deeper. She pulled strings, leveraged old favors, accessed restricted databases. She learned about Project Chimera, the clandestine program that now held Cale. Whispers of human experimentation, of attempts to weaponize extraordinary abilities, floated through the dark corners of the information network she tapped into. The more she uncovered, the more terrifying the picture became. Cale wasn't just imprisoned, he was a guinea pig, stripped of his autonomy, his humanity slowly being eroded under the guise of scientific study. Her clandestine activities, however, did not go unnoticed. Her prolonged absences, her unusual inquiries, her increasingly defiant attitude, it all raised red flags. One evening, after a particularly frustrating dead end in her search, Ilara returned to her small, Spartan apartment. The door was ajar. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Inside, the place was a wreck. Drawers pulled out, papers strewn everywhere, her old laptop smashed. And then she saw it.
A framed photograph of her and her younger brother, the last physical memento she possessed of him, lay shattered on the floor, the glass splintered, the image defaced. That wasn't all. Tucked beneath the broken frame was a small, crudely written note, anonymous and chilling. "Stop looking for the ghost. Some things are better left buried, or you might end up buried with them." The message was clear. She was being watched. And the threat was not just to her career, but to her life. The cold, calculated cruelty of shattering her brother's photograph, knowing it was her most cherished possession, was a gut punch. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of the deepest, most personal part of her. Her idealism, which had just begun to re-emerge, felt trampled, crushed under the heel of a ruthless system. This wasn't just about Cale anymore. It was about her own vulnerability, her own loss being weaponized against her. Days later, in the cold, sterile confines of the Project Chimera facility, Cale was undergoing yet another battery of tests. Electrodes were attached to his temples, his arms, his chest. Scientists in white coats murmured incomprehensible jargon, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes seeing only data, not a human being. He was probed, prodded, pushed to his limits, urged to demonstrate his abilities under various stimuli. He resisted, not out of defiance, but out of a desperate fear of hurting anyone, even these cold clinical figures. But their methods were insidious, designed to break down his psychological barriers, to force the power out. During one such session, a new, younger scientist who had shown a flicker of unease during previous tests cautiously approached him after the lead researcher had stepped away. Her voice was low, laced with genuine concern.
"Cale," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously, "you have to know. They're not trying to understand you. They're trying to control you, to weaponize you. There's a rumor. They're planning a procedure to isolate the source of your power. It's highly invasive, experimental. You could be destroyed." Cale's eyes widened, a sudden, terrifying realization dawning on him. He wasn't being evaluated. He was being harvested. His power, his very essence, was to be dissected, extracted, perhaps even replicated. The thought was more horrifying than any physical pain. It was the ultimate violation, the complete eradication of his identity, leaving only the weapon they sought to create. Just as the young scientist leaned in to whisper more, the lead researcher re-entered, his eyes sharp. The young scientist flinched away, her face paling. The lead researcher's gaze hardened, first at her, then at Cale. He saw the flicker of communication, the exchange of fear and information. "What was that, Dr. Albright?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "A little too friendly with the subject, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Albright stammered, trying to deny it, but her guilt was palpable. The lead researcher turned to Cale, his face a mask of cold fury. "You," he snarled, pointing a finger at Cale, "are nothing but a tool, a specimen. Don't you ever forget that. And don't you dare try to corrupt my staff." He then barked orders at a guard, confine the subject, full sensory deprivation, for the rest of the day, and informed Dr. Albright that her services are no longer required for Project Chimera. Cale watched the young scientist, her face a mask of shock and terror, being led away. He had inadvertently ruined her life. His attempt to save others, to forge a connection with Alara, had only led to more destruction, more pain, not just for him, but for those who dared to show him kindness. He was a contagion, a curse. The fragile hope of connection, of understanding, of not being a monster, shattered. He was nothing but a weapon, and his only purpose was to be contained, studied, and ultimately used or discarded. The deepest emotional point of the story had been reached. He questioned if he was ever worthy of connection, if he was destined only to destroy. The shatter point left both Cale and Alara adrift in their own personal hells.
For Kale, the sensory deprivation chamber was the ultimate prison within a prison. No light, no sound, just the suffocating blackness and the relentless echo of his own thoughts. The betrayal, the termination of the young scientist who had shown him a flicker of humanity, cemented his despair. He was a harbinger of destruction, not salvation. Every attempt he made to connect, every moment he dared to hope, resulted in suffering for someone else. Thorne's impossible demise, the shattered arm of a child, and now the ruined career of a compassionate young woman, all because of him, because of the uncontrollable force within him. He was a mistake, a flaw in the fabric of existence. The scientists at Project Chimera weren't wrong. He was a tool, a specimen, a danger to be managed. He allowed the darkness to consume him, embracing the idea that total emotional shutdown was his only recourse. If he felt nothing, if he was nothing, then perhaps he could inflict no more harm. He stopped resisting the experiments, offering only numb compliance. His mind retreated into a void, a desperate attempt to sever the connection between his consciousness and the destructive power that resided within. He lay on the cold floor, waiting for whatever invasive procedure they had planned, accepting his fate as a broken thing. The choice, for him, was to simply cease to be, to let them do whatever they wanted, so long as no one else suffered because of his continued, dangerous existence. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Vulnerability was a weakness that led to pain. He just wanted it to end. Miles away, in her small apartment, Ilara sat amidst the wreckage of her life, both physical and emotional. The broken photograph of her brother, his smiling face now obscured by cracks, felt like a metaphor for her own shattered hope. The threat, the invasion of her personal sanctuary, had rattled her to her core. Her superiors had given her a final, chilling warning. Drop it, Vance, or we drop you, and not just from the payroll. Her career, her pension, her carefully constructed, stable life, all hung by a thread. The system she had once believed in, however cynically, was now actively working against her, protecting its own dark secrets.
She stared at the fragments of her brother's picture, the one person she had ever truly loved, the one person whose memory had kept a tiny flame of idealism flickering within her. Her initial impulse was to retreat, to succumb to the fear, to simply give up on Kyle, to save herself. What good would she be to him if she lost everything, if she ended up buried with him, as the note suggested? The logical, pragmatic part of her, the hardened correctional officer, screamed for self-preservation. But then she remembered Kyle's eyes in the burning van. Not the eyes of a monster, but of a man wrestling with a terrifying burden, a man who chose to save them despite the immense risk. She remembered his halting confession in the hospital room, the profound loneliness in his voice. She remembered the strange, intrusive flashes of his painful past, the boy who had longed for connection but was perpetually cast out. He was alone, utterly, fundamentally alone, facing incomprehensible forces, and she was the only one who had seen his true nature, the only one who believed he was more than a weapon. Her brother's memory, usually a source of grief, now sparked a different kind of fire. He had been innocent, a victim of a brutal world. Kyle, too, was an innocent, a victim of his own birth, now facing a far more insidious brutality. What kind of person would she be if she turned her back on him now? What kind of justice would that serve? The question wasn't about saving her career anymore. It was about saving her soul. Ilara stood up, walking over to her shattered mirror, looking at her reflection. She saw the weariness, the fear, but also a flicker of resolve. She couldn't fight the entire government, not head-on, but she could fight for one man. She could expose the truth.
She could leverage whatever little power she had left. It was a fool's errand, a suicidal mission, but the alternative, abandoning Kyle, allowing them to destroy him, felt like a far greater death. She made her choice, not out of reckless heroism, but out of a quiet, burning conviction that some truths simply had to be told, some injustices had to be fought, no matter the cost. She would find Kyle. She would expose Project Chimera. She would give him a voice, a chance to be seen as a human being, not just a phenomenon. It was a choice born of vulnerability, of empathy, of a renewed commitment to a justice that had long felt out of reach. She began to pack a small bag, not with clothes, but with the few pieces of evidence she had managed to gather: cryptic notes, encrypted files, and an anonymous tip she had pursued. She knew the risks. She was putting her life on the line. But as she gripped her brother's broken photograph, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. The choice had been made. One reached out, through the silence and the systems. The other, in the depths of his despair, had yet to receive the message. The tension was palpable, a silent promise hanging in the air, waiting for one last, desperate effort to breach the divide. My online family, this is the moment of truth. Ilara has made a courageous, dangerous choice to fight for Kyle. Do you believe her actions can truly reach him in his despair? And what do you think will be the immediate consequences of her defiance? Your thoughts, predictions, and emotional reactions are eagerly awaited in the comments below. Ilara's choice set her on a collision course with the very system she had served. She vanished from Blackgate, leaving behind a carefully crafted trail of breadcrumbs for her few trusted contacts and an anonymous tip to a tenacious investigative journalist she'd secretly cultivated over the years. She drained her savings, bought a burner phone, and went off-grid. Her mission was clear: find Kyle, expose Project Chimera, and pray she wasn't too late. Her journey was a dangerous, solitary one, a frantic scramble across state lines, following whispered leads and encrypted messages. She learned about the clandestine facility's remote mountain location, disguised as a meteorological research station. The more she uncovered, the more terrifying the scale of the operation became. Not just Kyle, but other anomalies were being held, their unique abilities being catalogued and, in some cases, brutally suppressed or amplified. Meanwhile, Kyle was in the deepest pit of his despair. The sensory deprivation had broken his resistance. He was undergoing the invasive procedure the young scientist had warned him about. Not a physical operation, but a relentless, psychologically brutal attempt to force his powers to the surface, to identify and control the source. They subjected him to extreme sensory overload, then complete isolation, then emotional manipulation, trying to provoke a reaction, an uncontrollable outburst they could then map and replicate.
He felt like a raw nerve, his very being flayed open. He was a phantom of his former self, devoid of hope, convinced he deserved this fate. Just as he felt the last vestiges of his will slipping away, a sudden, jarring alarm blared through the facility. The lights flickered, then died, plunging his containment unit into utter darkness. Shouts, distant explosions, and the staccato rhythm of automatic gunfire echoed through the vents. Chaos. Ilara. She had made it. Through sheer force of will, ingenuity, and a few well-placed anonymous leaks, she had drawn enough attention to trigger an emergency raid by a specialized federal unit, albeit one unaware of the full scope of Project Chimera's unethical activities. In the ensuing pandemonium, Ilara, disguised as a technician, navigated the labyrinthine corridors, guided by the facility blueprints she had acquired. She moved with a silent, desperate urgency, her heart pounding. She found Kyle's unit, the heavy reinforced door now compromised by the power outage. With a surge of adrenaline, she forced it open.
Inside, Kyle lay on the floor, unresponsive, electrodes still clinging to his pale skin. He looked utterly broken, his eyes vacant. "Kale," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. She knelt beside him, tearing off the electrodes. His skin felt cold, his pulse faint. "Kale, it's me, Ilara. We have to go. They're coming." He stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open, but there was no recognition, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. He mumbled something unintelligible, retreating further into his brokenness. Ilara knew she couldn't physically carry him. The guards were closing in. Her courage, her careful planning would be for naught if she couldn't get through to him. She saw a small makeshift table nearby, still partially intact despite the chaos. On it lay a single, mundane object, a small ceramic mug. The kind you'd see in a hospital, plain and unremarkable. An idea, desperate and impulsive, sparked in her mind. She remembered his story, his fear of touch, his accidental destruction. She remembered the shattered vase, the broken arm, the impossible power that defined his isolation. And she remembered their brief, fragile connection, the offering of her open hand, the shared vulnerability. She took a deep breath. "Kale," she said, her voice louder now, urgent, cutting through the haze of his despair. "Look at me." He turned his head slowly, his eyes still blank. "This," Ilara said, picking up the ceramic mug, her hand trembling slightly. "This," Ilara said, picking up the ceramic mug, her hand trembling slightly. "This is fragile. Like all of us. Like our world. Like the people you've tried so hard not to hurt." She looked him directly in the eyes, pouring all her empathy, all her renewed hope into her gaze. "But you don't have to shatter it, Kale. You can protect it." She slowly, deliberately placed the ceramic mug into his unresponsive, shackled hands. His fingers, which had destroyed so much, closed around the delicate object. For a moment, nothing. Then a flicker, a memory. The vase, the girl, Thorn, the terror. "It's okay, Kale," Ilara whispered, her voice a lifeline. "You're not a monster. You never were. You're just powerful. And you can choose how to use that power. You chose to save me. You chose to save those guards. You can choose again." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate whisper, echoing the profound, universal theme of their journey. "You can choose to love this world, Kale, to protect it, to finally connect with it. Don't let them turn you into a weapon. Choose to be." And then she did the unthinkable. She reached out, gently, and placed her hand over his, pressing his fingers just a little more firmly around the mug. For the first time, her touch wasn't met with fear or destruction. It was met with a slow, agonizing return. Kyle's eyes, storm cloud gray, slowly cleared. The emptiness receded, replaced by recognition, by a spark of understanding, and then a welling up of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. He felt the delicate curve of the mug, the warmth of Ilara's hand over his. He felt the power, still there, thrumming beneath his skin, but now it felt different. Less a curse, more a part of him, waiting for his command, his choice. He looked at Ilara, truly saw her, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes shining with fierce conviction. He saw not a guard, but a savior. Not an observer, but a kindred spirit who had dared to reach across the chasm of his isolation. He tightened his grip on the mug. Not too much, not too little. Just enough. The power was there, controlled, responsive. He slowly, deliberately lifted the mug, then gently set it back down on the table, unbroken.
"We go," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. the first truly conscious words he had spoken since his capture. He looked at Alara, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Together. Together they navigated the chaotic facility, Kale moving with a newfound, terrifying confidence. He didn't annihilate, but he moved obstacles with impossible ease, deflecting dangers, creating paths where none existed. He used his power not with brute force, but with a precise, almost graceful control, a protector rather than a destroyer. Ilara, at his side, guided him, her mind sharp, her resolve unshakable. They were a formidable, unlikely team, one mind, one impossible force, fighting for freedom and truth. They reached the outside, emerging into the crisp mountain air as federal agents swarmed the facility. The investigative journalist Alara had tipped off was there, cameras rolling, ready to expose Project Chimera. Kale stood beside Alara, no longer shrinking from the attention, but standing tall, his presence radiating a quiet strength. The shackles were still on his wrists, a lingering symbol of his past, but they no longer defined him. He looked at Alara, a profound gratitude in his eyes. He had found not just freedom, but connection. Not just release from a physical prison, but from the emotional one he had built around himself. She had taught him that his power wasn't a curse to be hidden, but a responsibility to be wielded with conscious choice, guided by a heart that could now, finally, love. The fear of breaking, of hurting, was still there, a constant companion, but it was now tempered by the unwavering belief that he could control it, for good. The cameras flashed, the questions began, but in that moment, for Kale and Alara, the world outside faded. They had found each other, two lonely souls bound by impossible circumstances, and forged an unexpected, unbreakable love. The journey wasn't over. The fight for justice had just begun. But Kale finally understood. He wasn't alone. He was loved, understood, and finally truly free to be himself. My incredible online family, what an emotional roller coaster! Kale has chosen connection over isolation, love over despair, and found a true partner in Alara. What does this resolution signify for his future and for Alara's? How do you feel about their unexpected journey and the power of human connection? Share your final thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and remember to like this video, subscribe for more stories, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Thank you for being a part of our family.